The barn was locked tight, the screens trapped inside, and the night sky glowed red with fire. 9 powerful plantation masters believed themselves untouchable until a servant named Isabella de Santiago proved them wrong in 1704. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a woman forced into vengeance by cruelty? Tonight, we uncover her forgotten story. If you enjoy uncovering history's secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. And let's step into the fire history tried to erase. To understand Isabella de Santiago's world, we must step back into the early 18th century, an age when empires fed their power with sugar, tobacco, and human suffering. The year was 1704, and across the Caribbean, plantations stretched like kingdoms. Behind the high walls and guarded estates, the wealth of Europe was being forged in fire and blood. The Spanish crown controlled vast territories, from Cuba to Santo Domingo, and their plantations were not only centers of production, but also fortresses of hierarchy. Every grain of sugar that sweetened a European table was extracted from the sweat of enslaved Africans and indentured servants. Overseers carried whips, masters held the law in their fists, and rebellion was crushed before it could even form into words. The life of a servant in this world was brutal beyond imagination. Work began before sunrise and ended only when darkness made the fields impossible to navigate. Men bent their backs cutting cane until their hands bled raw. Women, often forced into both labor and service within the master's household, faced humiliation that went unspoken but was deeply felt. Children were robbed of childhood, thrown into work before their bodies had even grown strong enough to bear it. And yet, within this rigid system of oppression, small sparks of defiance still glimmered. Stories of maroon settlements, hidden communities of runaway slaves in the mountains circulated among the servants like whispers of freedom. These tales were dangerous, but they gave hope. And hope, even in small doses, was a weapon the masters feared. The barn itself, the one Isabella would one day set ablaze, was more than just a structure for storing tools and supplies. In plantations of the era, barns doubled as gathering halls for overseers and masters, places where decisions about labor quotas, punishments, and profits were made. To servants like Isabella, the barn was a place where their suffering was calculated and discussed, often while their masters laughed over wine. In 1704, society was held together by fear of the lash, fear of the law, fear of rebellion. Colonial authorities enforced strict punishments for even minor resistance. A stolen loaf of bread could mean a public whipping. An attempt to flee might result in branding, mutilation, or death. The masters believed themselves untouchable, protected not only by soldiers and overseers, but by a system designed to crush anyone who dared to rise against them. But beneath that surface of control, the ground trembled with tension. Servants and enslaved workers remembered every insult, every scar, every stolen life. That simmering anger built like heat within a furnace, waiting only for someone bold enough or desperate enough to strike the match. This was the world Isabella de Santiago lived in. A world where her name was spoken only as an order, where her body was considered property, where her will was supposed to be broken. And yet, in that same world, the foundations of rebellion were forming. Isabella's story does not begin with fire. It begins here, in the suffocating order of a plantation system that demanded obedience. For years, she endured it in silence. But history tells us that silence never lasts forever. Isabella de Santiago's life began not in fire, but in shadows. Born at the edge of poverty, her earliest memories were of hunger and hardship. Some say she was the daughter of a struggling washerwoman in Havana. Others whisper she had African blood from a grandfather carried across the Atlantic in chains. Whatever her lineage, one fact remained certain. Isabella was born into a world that had no place for her beyond servitude. By the time she was 12, she was sold into labor. A plantation on the outskirts of Santiago claimed her as property. For the masters, she was nothing more than another pair of hands, another body to bend under the relentless Caribbean sun. For Isabella, childhood ended the moment she crossed through the gates of the estate. Her days were long and merciless. Before dawn, she was sent to the fields, carrying water for men who cut cane until their backs ached. At night, she was summoned to sweep, scrub, or serve at the master's table, her presence invisible unless she made a mistake. The sound of laughter and wine spilling into goblets would echo above her bowed head while her own stomach growled from hunger. But the cruelty was not only in the work, it was in the constant humiliation. Overseers barked insults as easily as orders. Punishments were swift and merciless. A dropped tray could mean a lash. A slow step could mean a slap. For Isabella, each blow left not only bruises but a lesson. She was meant to be broken, obedient, voiceless. Yet Isabella was not easily broken. Beneath her silence lived a sharp mind and an iron will. She watched everything: the arrogance of the masters, the patterns of their habits, the cracks in their walls of power. She memorized the way the barn doors locked, the places where lanterns were stored, the routes overseers took when they patrolled at night. What others saw as endless drudgery, Isabella treated as quiet preparation. Still, strength came at a cost. Servants who showed defiance were marked quickly. To survive, Isabella learned to wear two faces. In front of the masters, she kept her eyes down, her voice soft, her movements obedient. But when she was alone with the other servants, whispers of her courage began to spread. She was the one who dared to smuggle bread to a starving child. She was the one who stepped between an overseer and an old man too weak to work. And she was the one who spoke in hushed tones of the possibility that life could be different, that cruelty could be answered. But Isabella's fire was not only fueled by her own suffering. Somewhere along the way, she lost someone dear: a sister, a friend, perhaps even a lover, to the merciless hands of the plantation system. Some say her sister was beaten to death for trying to steal a bit of food. Others claim her closest friend was dragged away by the master one night, never to return the same. Whatever the truth, that loss carved a wound so deep that obedience no longer felt possible. Isabella endured the years with clenched fists and silent resolve. Every insult, every lash, every stolen dream became fuel. She did not yet know how she would strike back, only that the day would come when silence would no longer suffice. And so, the servant girl grew into a young woman, strong, cunning, hardened by suffering, but not defeated by it. To the masters, she was still invisible, just another shadow passing quietly through their world. They could not see what she was becoming, for Isabella de Santiago was not simply surviving. She was waiting. To understand Isabella's rage, one must first meet the men who fed it. The 9 plantation masters of Santiago were not faceless figures of wealth and power. They were flesh and blood, arrogant and cruel, believing themselves untouchable. Each man carried his own reputation for brutality, and together they formed a wall of oppression that pressed down on every servant and enslaved worker in their reach. Don Alonso Ruiz, the eldest, was a man of iron will and cold precision. He believed in punishment as discipline, and his whips were said to cut deeper than the blades of the cane harvesters. His philosophy was simple. Fear kept order, and order made profit. Beside him was Don Cristobal Varela, known less for his discipline and more for his indulgence. He drank heavily, treated women as possessions, and believed pleasure was his birthright. Isabella had endured his leering gaze more than once, each time forcing her body to remain still while her spirit seethed within. Then there was Hernando Morales, younger, ambitious, eager to prove himself. He was the one who sought out the smallest mistakes, punishing servants harshly to display his authority. It was said he once whipped a boy nearly to death for breaking a water jug. The others were no better. Don Esteban carried a cane, not just as a walking stick, but as a weapon, striking anyone who crossed his path. Don Rodrigo prided himself on clever cruelty, inventing punishments that were designed to humiliate as much as to harm. Don Mateo, Don Francisco, Don Diego, and Don Pedro completed the circle, each one different in manner, but identical in belief that the lives of those who served them were expendable, tools to be used until broken. Together, these 9 men ruled their estates like monarchs, their authority unquestioned. Their meetings often took place in the large barn half-storage, half-council chamber where they discussed crops, shipments, profits, and punishments. To servants, that barn was a place of dread. Decisions made within its walls rippled across the fields like lashes from a whip, and Isabella had witnessed it all. She had stood silent in the corners, carrying trays of wine, pouring water, sweeping floors, while the masters laughed and schemed above her. They never saw her as a person only, as part of the scenery, as unimportant as the dust she swept away. In their arrogance, they never imagined that the servant girl who kept her eyes lowered was memorizing every word, every habit, every weakness. But cruelty was not just practiced in meetings, it was lived every day. When harvests fell short, the masters blamed the workers. When overseers demanded quotas, the servants bore the punishment. When nights grew long and boredom gnawed at their wealth, they turned their frustrations on the vulnerable. Isabella's back carried scars of their authority, but her heart carried something sharper, the memory of every injustice. The 9 men believed themselves invincible because the system told them so. Colonial law protected their wealth, soldiers defended their estates, and priests often turned a blind eye, preaching obedience instead of justice. They dined under chandeliers, rode fine horses, and congratulated themselves on their brilliance as landowners. Yet all their riches were built upon the broken bodies of those who had no voice. Isabella knew each man by name, by habit, by cruelty. And as the years passed, their faces became not just the image of her oppressors, but the fuel for the fire she carried inside. Every insult, every bruise, every tear shed in silence became a weight pressing down upon her chest, until one day that weight would no longer be borne. For years, Isabella endured the lash of her masters, swallowing pain and forcing herself into silence. But every soul has a limit, and in the summer of 1704, Isabella's was finally reached. The day began like so many others' scorching sun, sweat soaking her dress, her hands raw from scrubbing floors. Yet it ended in tragedy. A young servant boy named Mateo, no more than 13, collapsed from exhaustion while carrying a load of cane. His small body crumpled into the dirt, his breath shallow. Instead of mercy, Don Hernando Morales ordered the overseers to teach him a lesson. Before Isabella's eyes, the boy was beaten until his cries fell silent. His lifeless body was carried away like a sack of waste, tossed into the ground without prayer or stone to mark his name. For Isabella, that moment was like a crack in the earth beneath her feet. Mateo's death was not the first she had witnessed. She had lost friends, even a sister, but this time, something shifted. The boy's blank eyes seemed to stare into her soul, asking why she still endured, why she still bowed. That night, as she washed her hands of his blood, Isabella felt her own obedience. The cruelty of the masters no longer just weighed on her shoulders, it demanded an answer. And Isabella, for the first time, resolved to give one. She began to plan in silence, her rage tempered into something sharper than fire: patience. She studied the barn, where the masters gathered often for their feasts and councils. She memorized the hinges, the locks, the beams that could hold against force if barred from outside. She took note of where the lantern oil was stored, of how easily dry straw and cane husks caught flame. But vengeance could not be built on knowledge. Alone it required courage. Isabella sought the counsel of other servants in whispers, testing whether they too were ready to strike. Most shook their heads in fear. Some begged her to stay silent, warning that rebellion brought nothing but death. Yet a few offered quiet encouragement, though they dared not stand beside her openly. Alone but undeterred, Isabella began to gather what she needed. At night, she tucked away scraps of oil-soaked cloth. She practiced moving silently, rehearsing in her mind how she would fasten the barn doors. Each step was dangerous if discovered. She would face a punishment worse than death. But by then, fear had lost its hold on her. What gave her strength was not hatred alone, but justice. The faces of the masters haunted her. Don Alonso with his lash, Cristobal with his hunger, Hernando with his cruelty, and the others with their endless arrogance. To Isabella, they were not men. They were the embodiment of a system that crushed lives for profit. And if no one else would strike against it, then she would. The night before her act, Isabella knelt in the dirt outside her quarters. Some say she whispered prayers to God, others that she prayed to older spirits carried from Africa, still alive in the hearts of the servants. Whatever the truth, she rose with fire in her eyes. Her decision sealed that there would be no turning back. For Isabella de Santiago, the death of one boy was the breaking point. The next time the 9 masters gathered in their barn, she would make sure they never walked out alive. The night was thick with silence. A full moon hung low, its pale glow casting long shadows across the cane fields. The air carried the heavy scent of sweat, molasses, and smoke from distant cooking fires. For most servants, it was a night like any other, a night of weary bodies collapsing into restless sleep. But for Isabella de Santiago, this was the night she had been waiting for. Inside the barn, laughter echoed like thunder. The 9 plantation masters had gathered, as they often did, to drink, boast, and congratulate themselves on another season of profit wrung from human misery. The barn doors were thrown wide when the meeting began, lantern lights spilling into the night. But Isabella lingered in the shadows, her presence unnoticed as always. She carried a jug of wine, her eyes downcast, her steps obedient. None of the men gave her more than a glance, but in her mind she counted every one of them. Don Alonso at the head of the table, rigid as ever, barking orders even as he drank. Cristobal, his voice slurred, laughing too loudly. Hernando, smirking at his own cruel jokes. One by one, she confirmed their presence, her pulse steady despite the storm raging inside her. All 9 were here. When her duties were finished, Isabella slipped away. She moved with the silence of someone who had practiced every step 100 times. The barn doors creaked as she pulled them shut, an ordinary task in the eyes of any passerby. But then, with swift precision, she dropped a heavy iron bar across the handles, locking the men inside. Another beam followed, wedged tight against the frame. Inside, the laughter continued. Unaware of the trap closing around them, Isabella reached for the small bundle she had hidden earlier. Rags soaked in lantern oil. She stuffed them into cracks in the wooden walls, her hands steady as she struck flint to steel. The first spark caught, then another, until tiny flames began to lick hungrily at the dry straw piled around the barn's foundation. At first, there was only the faint crackle of fire. But within moments, smoke curled upward, black against the moonlight. Then came the roar. The fire caught in earnest, spreading across the thatched roof, feeding on wood and oil like a living beast unleashed. The laughter inside faltered. Shouts rang out, followed by pounding footsteps. The masters rushed to the doors, rattling the handles, demanding them open. But Isabella had secured them too well. The heavy bar held firm. Their shouts grew frantic, muffled by the rising roar of the flames. "Open this door." Alonso's voice thundered. "Who's out there?" Cristobal screamed, his tone shrill with terror. The sound of fists and shoulders slamming into wood echoed into the night. Isabella stood a few paces away, her face lit by the glow of the inferno. For years, she had been forced to keep her eyes down, to hide her defiance. Tonight, she raised her head high, watching as the men who had once seemed untouchable clawed desperately for their lives. The fire spread quickly now. Flames curled through the rafters, collapsing beams in showers of sparks. Smoke poured from the gaps, choking the voices inside. The barn became a furnace, every scream sharpened into a howl of fear and agony. The servants and enslaved workers, drawn by the noise, gathered at a distance. Some gasped in horror, others whispered prayers, but not one dared to move forward. They knew what was happening, even if no one spoke it aloud. Their faces reflected firelight and fear of what would follow, but also a flicker of something else. Hope dot for the first time. They saw their master's powerless dot inside the barn. The pounding slowed, then weakened. The shouts became hoarse cries, then coughs, then silence. The flames devoured everything timbers, barrels, flesh until the barn stood as a towering pyre against the night sky. Isabella did not flinch. She did not cry. She only watched, her heart heavy but resolute. This was not joy. It was justice. The only justice left in a world that had denied her humanity. When at last the barn collapsed in a thunder of sparks and ash, the ground shook beneath her feet. The screams had ended. The 9 masters were no more. Isabella turned from the blaze and vanished into the darkness. Some say she fled into the mountains, joining maroon communities that sheltered fugitives. Others claim she stayed among the servants for days, silent, until colonial soldiers came searching. But that night, one truth could not be denied. Isabella de Santiago had struck a blow no one thought possible. She had burned the untouchable, and the echoes of that fire would spread far beyond the plantation walls. By dawn, the plantation was unrecognizable. The barn was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, its charred beams jutting upward like broken teeth against the sky. The air reeked of smoke, ash, and something fouler, the smell of burned flesh. Where laughter and arrogance had filled the night before, only silence remained. The servants stood in clusters, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Some trembled with fear of what would come next. Others felt a strange, unspoken release, as though invisible chains had loosened. For the first time in memory, the plantation masters were gone. But freedom was not theirs to claim, not yet. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, riders had galloped to neighboring estates and into the town of Santiago. Colonial authorities responded with fury. Soldiers stormed the plantation, searching for survivors among the ashes. They found only blackened bones, fused together in grotesque shapes. The sight chilled even hardened men. The 9 most powerful landowners in the district had perished in one night, and whispers spread that it was no accident. Suspicion fell upon the servants immediately. Interrogations began with whips and threats, overseers demanding names, demanding answers. Most remained silent. Fear kept their mouths shut, but so did something else: loyalty to the woman who had dared to do what none of them could. Isabella's name was not spoken, but her absence was noticed. Some accounts claimed she fled that very night, disappearing into the jungle before the authorities arrived. It is said she found refuge among the Maroons in the mountains, where runaway slaves had carved out hidden villages. There, she became a ghost story whispered by firesides. The woman who burned her masters alive and lived to see freedom. Other records suggest a darker ending. A captured servant, broken under torture, may have spoken her name. According to one tale, Isabella was found days later, hiding near the river with nothing but a sack of bread and a stolen knife. She was dragged before colonial judges in chains, her body bruised, but her eyes unbroken. The trial, if it happened, was less about justice and more about vengeance. Authorities could not allow her act to inspire others. They painted her as a demon, a corrupter, a danger to the fragile order of the colonies. Witnesses were called to describe her silence, her defiance, her supposed unnatural strength. The judges pronounced her guilty of mass murder, arson, and rebellion. Her sentence, depending on which version one believes, was either hanging in the public square or being burned alive, the same fate she had delivered to her masters. Some say her last words were whispered prayers. Others claim she stared into the faces of her executioners and declared, "I gave back what was given to us." And yet, legends persist that no trial ever took place. Some insist she vanished into the hills, her name carried in secret songs sung by those who longed for freedom. To them, Isabella was never caught because she was never meant to be. She became less a woman of flesh and blood and more a spirit of rebellion, a story to frighten masters and to embolden servants. Whether she died in chains or lived in freedom, the aftermath of her act was undeniable. Plantation owners across Santiago tightened their grip on their workers, terrified that others might follow Isabella's path. Laws grew harsher, punishments more severe, but fear also lingered on the other side fear in the eyes of the masters, who now knew that their wealth and power were not impenetrable. The fire had consumed more than a barn. It had consumed the illusion of invincibility. Isabella de Santiago's fate remains uncertain. History offers fragments, contradictions, and whispers, but no single truth. What we do know is this. In 1704, a servant woman lit a match that still smolders in the memory of the oppressed. Centuries have passed since the flames of that barn lit the night sky of Santiago. Yet the name Isabella de Santiago still lingers in the margins of history, half legend, half ghost. Some historians dismiss her story as folklore, too sensational to be real. Others argue it was deliberately suppressed, erased from official records, because it struck too close to the heart of colonial fear. But whether flesh and blood or myth carried through whispers, Isabella's story speaks to something deeper than fact. It speaks to truth. Her act was violent. Yes, 9 men burned alive in a storm of fire and screams. But in a world where cruelty was law, where servants and slaves were treated as less than human, where justice had no seat at the table, what other path was left? To the masters, she was a criminal. To the authorities, she was a warning. But to the oppressed, Isabella was something more. Proof that even the weakest, the voiceless, the invisible, could rise and strike back. Her story reminds us that history is not only written in the ink of kings and governors. It is also carved in fire, in whispers, in acts of defiance too dangerous to be recorded openly. For every plantation master who believed himself untouchable, Isabella's fire proved otherwise. For every servant who felt trapped in silence, her courage lit a path, even if only for a moment. And what do we, centuries later, make of her? Was she a monster, consumed by vengeance, or a martyr, forced into rebellion by unrelenting cruelty? That is the uncomfortable question history leaves us with. Perhaps she was both a woman shaped by suffering into something larger than herself. Perhaps justice in 1704 could only take the form of fire. The truth may never be fully known. Did Isabella perish at the gallows, her body swinging for all to see? Or did she vanish into the mountains, becoming a ghost that haunted the nightmares of the powerful? The uncertainty itself has power, for it leaves her legend alive, untamed, impossible to silence. Today, Isabella's tale stands as a mirror. It forces us to look at the cost of unchecked power, at the suffering hidden beneath wealth, at the ways ordinary people can be driven to extraordinary acts when cornered by cruelty. Whether we condemn her or honor her, we cannot ignore her. Isabella de Santiago may not appear in school textbooks. you won't find her name etched into monuments. But in the echoes of fire, in the quiet strength of those who endured and resisted, her spirit remains. A servant who became a symbol. A woman who turned silence into flame. And so I leave you with this. If you had lived in Isabella's world, what choice would you have made? To bow your head and endure, or to light the fire? If Isabella's story moved you, share your thoughts below. Do you see her as a murderer or a fighter for justice? Comment where you're listening from, and let your voice join the conversation. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the forgotten stories history tried to bury. Because here, we remember.